Claire Bennett stood at the center of the orchard clearing, clipboard against her hip, reciting the order of a stranger's wedding from memory, processional, vows, the exact minute the string quartet would shift key. She didn't glance at the page once. Marcus Bell knelt by the arbor a few feet away, tightening a bolt that didn't need tightening. "You'd make a great bride someday," he said, not looking up. "You've got the whole thing memorized better than the woman actually getting married." Claire didn't look up either. "I'd need a groom for that." The wrench in Marcus's hand went still. Keep that answer in mind. By the end of this one, those few words would mean something neither of them saw coming. Before we go further, if stories about quiet people and the secrets they carry are the kind of thing you came here for, take a second to follow along. It's a small thing, and it's what lets this one keep going. Now, back to the orchard, and the man tightening a bolt that was already tight. The orchard had belonged to the Bennett family before either of them was born. Rows of cherry trees planted by Claire's grandfather turned into a wedding venue by her father 2 decades later, when the fruit alone stopped covering what the land cost to keep. Claire had grown up walking the trellises before she'd learned to read a balance sheet, and she ran the place now the way Walter Bennett had taught her. Early mornings. Long nights. A phone that never went fully quiet, not even on Sundays. Marcus had been hired 3 months earlier to rebuild the ceremony arbor and the wooden stage behind it. One of a dozen local contractors her assistant had lined up before Claire settled on him specifically. His estimates were honest, his work was clean. He didn't pad an invoice the way the last 2 carpenters had. He kept to himself. Showed up early, worked until the light went, and drove back into town where his son was waiting with dinner half made and homework half finished. Around them, the crew was already breaking for the day, folding tarps, coiling cords, calling good nights across the gravel. Claire watched Marcus gather his tools without a wasted motion. The kind of economy that comes from doing a thing so many times it stops requiring thought. She'd noticed it before. She hadn't let herself wonder why. What she didn't see was the rest of his evening. The drive back with the radio low. The kitchen where Elijah had gotten the pasta water boiling but forgotten the salt, a math worksheet abandoned at the 3rd problem because problem 3 was hard. And Marcus was the one who explained the hard ones. 9 years old and already convinced he could run the whole operation himself, mostly proud when his father let him try. Marcus checked the homework, salted the water, and didn't mention that he'd been on his feet since 6. That part he kept to himself, too. It was easier than the alternative, which was letting a 9-year-old carry something that was never his to carry. Ruth Callahan, the company's longtime accountant, found Claire by the front gate a few minutes later, a folder under one arm, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. "You've got the anniversary meeting Thursday," Ruth said. 12 months since your father passed. The board wants it on record before the window closes." Claire didn't need reminding. The will had given her a year of sole authority. 1 year to run Bennett Orchard Estates exactly as she saw fit, no board approval required for anything short of selling the land outright. After that, every major decision went back to a vote of 7 people, most of whom had known her since she was in pigtails. None of whom had run a business through a single wedding season. She'd known the date was coming the way you know a storm is coming from 3 states away. Knowing hadn't made it any easier to watch it arrive. "I'll be ready," Claire said. Ruth studied her a moment too long before nodding and walking off toward the office. Heels clicking against gravel the way they had at the end of every workday for 20 years. Claire turned back toward the arbor and found Marcus already watching her, not with curiosity, just the quiet attention of a man who notices when someone's carrying something heavy and doesn't need to ask about it out loud. "Long week?" he asked. "Long year," she said, and left it there. The next morning, Elijah Bell showed up with his father for the first time that season. 9 years old and already taller than the toolbox he carried. He set it down at the base of the arbor, careful the way he'd been taught, and looked up at Claire with the unguarded directness only children manage. "Are you the lady who owns all the cherry trees?" "I am." There's a lot of them. There are. About 6,000, if you count the young ones that haven't fruited yet. Elijah considered that number with real seriousness, the way a 9-year-old considers anything that sounds impossibly large, then reached into his pocket and held out a small tangle of ribbon he'd found in the grass. Leftover trim from a wedding the week before. You dropped this. I think it belongs to a bride. I think you're right, Claire said, crouching to take it from him. Thank you for finding it. Marcus watched from the ladder, something in his chest loosening in a way he chose not to examine too closely. Elijah wandered off toward a row of half-finished chairs stacked near the equipment shed, already narrating some private game to himself, and Claire straightened up, brushing grass from her knees. He's got good manners. His mother's doing. Mostly, Marcus said. I just keep him fed and on time for school. It was the first time in 3 months he'd mentioned a mother at all. Claire didn't push. She'd learned, in this line of work, that people tell you what they're ready to tell you, in the order they're ready to tell it. And rushing them only closes the door faster than it would have shut on its own. She tucked the ribbon into her jacket pocket instead of the lost and found bin by the office door. She couldn't have said why at the time. It stayed there through the rest of the week, forgotten and not forgotten, the way small things sometimes are. Grant Sullivan arrived an hour later in his usual gray suit, out of place among the sawdust and the ladders, tablet already lit to a spreadsheet before he'd finished crossing the gravel. Claire's cousin, twice removed, technically, though the family called him closer than that out of habit. He'd worked alongside Walter Bennett for over a decade. Handled the business side while Walter handled the trees. And since Walter's death, the board had leaned on him more than anyone expected. Grant included. Maintenance on the west section is up 11% from last season, he said. Not quite a greeting. I'll bring the full numbers Thursday, Claire said. Bring them. Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just want everyone informed before we vote. He left the way he'd come. Claire watched him go with the particular exhaustion of managing a relative instead of an employee. Marcus hadn't said a word during the exchange, but he'd clocked it. Filed it away the same way he filed a joint that didn't sit quite square. Something worth keeping an eye on later. Autumn settled over Traverse City the way it did every year. Tourists thinning out, the bay turning a colder shade of blue roadside, stands swapping their summer signs for cider and pumpkins. Claire had lived here her whole life and never once seriously considered leaving. Not even during the 2 years after the wedding that didn't happen, when half the town seemed to know her business better than she knew it herself. Marcus had grown up 2 counties over and landed here only because his late wife's mother had a spare house and a willingness to help raise a grandson she adored. Neither of them had planned on staying for the other's sake. Neither would have admitted, yet, that it was starting to change. Vivian Cole walked the grounds on a Tuesday morning. A branding consultant Claire had hired back in spring and half-forgotten booking. Camera around her neck, a notepad she barely used, more interested in touching things than photographing them. The grain of the arbor posts, the angle of the trellis joints, the way the ceremony stage caught the morning light without paint to help it. She stopped cold at the stage, running her palm along a seam where 2 beams met without a single visible nail or bracket. Who built this joint? I did, Marcus said, coming around from the far side with a level in one hand. Vivian looked at him properly for the first time, and something shifted behind her eyes. This is an Alden and Rowe cut. I'd know it anywhere. I used a photograph of this exact technique in a branding deck 10 years ago. She stepped back, studying him now instead of the wood. Marcus Bell. You did the Marchetti wedding, the floating stage over the koi pond. That ran in 3 separate trade write-ups. Claire, a few feet off with a clipboard, looked up slowly. That was a while back, Marcus said. A while back, Vivian repeated, half laughing, not unkindly. You basically invented that joint. People in the industry assumed you'd retired rich and stopped answering your email. Something like that. His tone closed the subject like a door swinging shut. Vivian, sensing she'd wandered somewhere she wasn't meant to, excused herself to finish her walk of the grounds, camera swinging at her side. Claire didn't move for a moment. She was doing the math in her head. The man she'd hired for local, dependable carpentry had spent years building ceremony stages for some of the most photographed weddings on the East Coast, had a technique named after him in the write-ups, and had never once mentioned any of it across 3 months of coffee over sawhorses. What Vivian hadn't said, and what Marcus wouldn't, was that for a good stretch of those years the name in the captions hadn't been his at all. The technique got named after him eventually, once it couldn't be avoided. The early work had gone out under the firm's partners, under the designers who'd hired him, under everyone with a cleaner story to sell to a magazine. He'd built the thing. Other people had been photographed standing next to it. He'd made a kind of peace with that a long time ago. The peace you make when the alternative is spending your life angry about something you can't change. And he wasn't going to explain any of it now, least of all why he'd let it go so easily the day he finally walked away. "You could have said something," Claire said finally, once the two of them were alone by the stage. Marcus picked the level back up, checked a beam that didn't need checking. "It wasn't relevant to the arbor. That's not why you didn't say it." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Then, without looking at her, I left that work 6 years ago. Same month my wife died. The travel, 40 weeks a year, sometimes more, it worked fine when there were 2 of us raising Elijah. It didn't work alone." He set the level down for good this time. "I'm not hiding a career, Claire. I'm just not in it anymore. And I didn't see the point in bringing up a version of my life that isn't mine now." Claire looked at him, really looked, in a way she hadn't quite let herself before, and something in her chest recognized something in his. She knew what it was to keep a door shut on a version of your own life you weren't ready to walk back into. She didn't say any of that out loud. She only nodded once and let the moment pass without turning it into more than it already was. "The arbor looks good," she said instead. "It should. I had good training." A small, careful smile passed between them, the first one all season that wasn't strictly about work. 3 miles away, in an office with better carpet than the one Claire used. Grant Sullivan closed his door and dialed a number saved under a name that wasn't the real one. "It's Grant," he said when the line picked up. 12 months, right on schedule. Votes this week. A pause while someone spoke on the other end. "I told you already. Once the sole authority window closes, the board decides. And the board listens to me. They always have." Another pause, longer this time, his jaw tightening. "The commission's still in writing, correct? I want that confirmed in front of me before I stand up and say a word to anyone." He hung up and sat a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't especially want to say out loud, not even to himself. Back at the orchard, Marcus noticed the flags first. Thin wire stakes with orange plastic tips driven into the ground along the western tree line where the older cherries gave way to the parcel nobody paid much attention to. Survey markers. He knew what they were because he'd worked enough job sites to know when someone was measuring land they intended to do something with. 2 days later, he saw Grant out past the last row with a man in a windbreaker he didn't recognize, the two of them standing over the flags, the stranger pointing at a tablet while Grant nodded. They didn't see him. He was 40 yards off, kneeling over a stack of cedar, and he watched the way he watched most things, quietly, filing it away. A stake in the ground wasn't proof of anything. But Marcus had built enough to know when a thing wasn't sitting square, and this didn't. He said nothing about it to anyone. He forgot none of it. The board's preliminary meeting happened 2 days later, in a conference room that still smelled faintly of the coffee Walter Bennett used to insist on brewing himself every morning before anyone else arrived. Grant stood at the head of the table, a slide already projected, orchard maintenance costs climbing steadily upward, a red line crossing a blue one somewhere around the current fiscal year. The kind of chart designed to alarm before anyone has time to ask a follow-up question. I'm not saying we sell everything, Grant said, in the reasonable voice he used when he wanted to sound like the only adult in the room. I'm saying the west parcel isn't earning its keep the way the rest of the property is. Lakeshore Crown has made a serious offer, well above assessed value. We keep the venue, the house, the core acreage. We just get smart about the rest before it drags the whole company down with it. Claire sat across from him, hands folded, and let him finish before she spoke. The west parcel is half our ceremony backdrop. Grant, take it away, and you take the reason people book us a full year in advance instead of choosing a hotel ballroom. Sentiment isn't a line item. Neither is panic, Claire said. We have 3 weeks before my father's window closes. I'd like to use them finding a better answer than selling off the one thing that makes this place worth anything to anyone. A younger board member, a cousin on her mother's side who ran a shipping business out of the marina, tapped his pen against the table. How much has Lakeshore actually offered? Enough that it's tempting on paper, Grant said. And how long has this offer been sitting on the table? Claire asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems awfully specific for something that just landed this month. Grant's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. These things take time to negotiate properly. I wasn't going to bring you a half-formed offer. No, Claire said. I don't imagine you were. The room went quiet the way rooms get quiet when everyone is doing their own private math instead of listening to the person still talking. The vote wasn't today. Today was only the opening argument. But Claire left the meeting with the specific chill of knowing exactly how many days she had left and exactly how much ground she still needed to cover before Thursday came around. That night, Marcus noticed the lights still burning in Claire's office long after the crew had gone home. Instead of driving straight to collect Elijah, he found himself finishing a stage rail that didn't strictly need finishing. When he finally packed up his tools, she was still at her desk, jacket still on, as if she'd forgotten she was allowed to take it off at some point. "You're going to run yourself into the ground," he said from the doorway. "That's the plan," Claire said. Not quite joking. "There's a diner on Union that's still open this late." He glanced toward the equipment shed across the lot. "Or there's a space heater and a folding table about 40 feet from here, and I happen to know where the good coffee's hidden from the crew." She laughed, actually laughed, the first unguarded sound he'd heard from her in 3 months of working alongside her. Something about the shed sounded better than the diner. Quieter, hers, instead of open to the whole town. The shed it is, then. They ate sandwiches Marcus had packed for himself and Elijah and never gotten around to finishing, sitting on overturned crates under a single bare bulb. The smell of cut pine settling over everything like a second kind of quiet. Somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them deciding to steer there, the conversation drifted away from wedding logistics and toward the things people don't usually say out loud on a Tuesday night in an equipment shed. Elijah mentioned his mother used to sketch, Claire said. Wedding dresses, mostly. Marcus turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. She did custom work before he was born. Little sketches for friends. Nothing she ever charged real money for. She kept a whole notebook of them. I still have it, in a box at the house. He didn't offer anything more. Claire didn't ask for more. But something had cracked open a little wider than it had been an hour before. "I was engaged once," she said, surprising even herself with how easily it came out. "Here, on this property. 6 years ago, the same year I think as whatever happened to you." Marcus looked up. "It didn't happen, the wedding. He wasn't who I thought he was, and I found that out 3 weeks before the ceremony. Standing by the pond behind the east row. I spent the next 2 years pretending I ran this place for the love of cherry trees. Really, it was just easier than looking at that spot too closely." "Which spot?" She tilted her head toward the dark window, toward the shape of the orchard somewhere beyond it. "You'll walk past it eventually. You won't know it's the one." "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Walking away from all of it. The name, the write-ups, whatever it would have turned into by now." Marcus considered the question longer than most people would have. "Not the leaving. Some days I miss being good at something in front of people who noticed." Out here, nobody knows what I used to be able to do. They just see a guy with a truck full of lumber." "I noticed," Claire said, before Vivian ever said a word. "What did you notice?" "That you never build anything the easy way if there's a better way that takes twice as long." She turned her cup in her hands. "I figured that came from somewhere." Marcus didn't answer that directly, but something in his face eased. The particular relief of being seen for a thing you'd stopped expecting anyone to notice. Neither of them said anything more about the pond, or the notebook, or the 6 years each of them had spent quietly rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of an old one. When Claire started to stand, Marcus nudged the folding chair steady under her before she'd fully risen. An old habit from a lifetime of building things that had to hold weight. She settled back into it without comment, without either of them naming what the gesture was. Outside, the wind moved through the cherry trees the way it had for 60 autumns before this one, indifferent to boardrooms and deadlines and old engagements. And for a little while, neither of them thought about any of it. Word of the shed dinner reached Grant by the end of the week. The way small-town gossip always finds the person least entitled to hear it first. He used it the way he used most things, carefully, and in front of an audience that couldn't easily push back. "I only bring it up," Grant said at the next board session, addressing the table rather than Claire directly, "because perception matters. We're 3 weeks from a vote that decides this company's future, and our CEO is spending her evenings alone with the contractor she personally hired to rebuild the property. I'm not questioning her judgment outright. I'm asking the board to consider whether it's the only thing steering the room right now." A silence followed that Claire recognized instantly. Not confusion, agreement dressed up as caution. One of the older members, a friend of her father's for 30 years, cleared his throat. "It's a fair question, Claire, not an accusation. How do we know this isn't clouding things for you?" Claire kept her hands flat on the table until she trusted her voice to stay level. "Because I've run this company alone for a year, and the numbers back up every decision I've made in that time. If you want to question my judgment, question the numbers. Don't question who I choose to eat dinner with." The meeting ended without resolution, which was its own kind of damage. Nothing decided. Everyone unsettled, quietly recalculating. Word reached Marcus before Claire got the chance to tell him herself. He showed up at her office that evening still in his work clothes, sawdust on his forearms, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "You want me off the job?" he asked. No preamble at all. "Say the word. I'll finish the stage and disappear. Makes this easier on you, if that's what you need." No, immediate, sharper than she'd meant it to come out. Then, quieter, "No, I don't want that. That's not the same as wanting me here. I want you here." She said it, and for the first time, let him see that she meant it as more than a sentence about carpentry schedules. "Whatever this is between us, I'm not going to let Grant Sullivan decide it for me." Marcus didn't say anything clever back. He just nodded once, the way he did when a joint finally sat square after 3 tries. And something between them settled into a place it hadn't occupied before that night. Ruth Callahan hadn't stopped thinking about a single line in Grant's maintenance figures. She'd caught it the night after his presentation, cross-checking his numbers against the company's own books out of the same stubborn habit that had kept her at Bennett Orchard for over 2 decades. Most of the numbers matched. One didn't. An outside consulting fee, paid quarterly, routed through a vendor code she didn't recognize from anywhere in the system. She'd written it on a sticky note, stuck it to the edge of her monitor, and told herself she'd chase it down when she had a free afternoon. She didn't have one, not with the vote bearing down on all of them. So the note sat there, and she looked at it every morning, and it bothered her the way a wrong note in a familiar song bothers you until you have to stop and find it. That weekend she stopped and found it. Alone in the office with a space heater humming and a thermos of coffee going cold beside her, she pulled 2 years of vendor records and laid them out across the same conference table Grant liked to stand at during his presentations. The consulting fee showed up 8 separate times. Always the same amount. always routed through a shell entity called North Shore Advisory. She traced the entity's registered agent to a P.O. box in Traverse City, and after an hour of digging through public filings she probably wasn't technically supposed to be reading on a Saturday, she found the name listed behind it. Grant Sullivan. She checked the date on the brokerage filing twice, certain she'd misread it the first time. 14 months back. That put it 3 months before Walter Bennett's diagnosis. 5 before he died. Whatever Grant had been planning, he'd started planning it while Walter was still walking the rows every morning, still brewing that same terrible coffee, still trusting the man across the table with the numbers he was too tired to check himself anymore. Ruth had worked for this family long enough to have loved Walter Bennett the way you love people you've spent decades quietly protecting. She sat back in her chair for a long time before she finally picked up the phone. She arrived at Claire's office Monday morning before the first crew truck had even pulled into the lot. A folder held against her chest like something that might come apart if she loosened her grip on it. "I need you to see this before anything else happens this week." She laid it out piece by piece. The vendor entity, the registered agent, the payments that traced back not to any real consulting work but to a private brokerage agreement between Grant and Lakeshore Crown Resorts. Signed 14 months earlier, before Walter had even passed away. The agreement guaranteed Grant a commission if the West parcel sale closed after the sole authority window expired. He hadn't been protecting the company's finances at all. He'd been positioning himself to profit from selling it out from under her. And the timeline meant he'd started while her father was still alive, still sitting at the head of that same conference table. "I should have brought this to you sooner," Ruth said. "I had the first number weeks ago. I didn't want to believe what it meant, so I kept telling myself I needed more before I said anything." Claire read the documents twice, her hands steady in a way the rest of her wasn't. When she finally looked up, it wasn't anger on her face so much as exhaustion, the particular kind that comes from realizing you've spent a year defending a company against a threat that had been sitting inside it the whole time, dressed in a suit and calling itself family. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, still at her desk, the folder open in front of her. He didn't ask what was wrong before he pulled the second chair around and sat beside her, not across from her, beside her. He didn't offer advice. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He just stayed, close enough that she could lean sideways if she needed to. After a moment she did, just slightly, her shoulder against his. Neither of them made it into anything bigger than it needed to be. "I've been doing this alone for a year," she said, to the folder more than to him. "I didn't know how much until right now." "You're not doing it alone today," Marcus said, and left his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. "Close enough to matter. Not close enough to ask for anything. Now before we walk into that boardroom, one quick thing. If you've made it this far, you already know the story's about to turn, and you already know how much it matters that it turns the right way. If you want to see it land, and if you want the ones like this to keep coming, take a second to follow along before we go in. Because what happens next is the whole reason the story exists." The vote was Thursday. Claire had 3 days. The board convened for the final vote on a Thursday, 3 days ahead of the deadline written into Walter Bennett's will. Claire stood at the head of the table where Grant usually stood, a stack of documents in front of her instead of a slide deck. And she didn't raise her voice once through the whole presentation. She didn't need to. The numbers did the raising for her. The shell entity, the registered agent, the commission agreement dated months before her father's death, all of it laid out in an order that made the story impossible to misread, no matter how anyone in the room wanted to spin it. Grant tried to turn it the way she'd expected he would. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he said, gesturing loosely toward the back of the room where Marcus sat at Claire's request. "She's built her entire defense around a man she's personally involved with. Ask yourselves whose judgment is actually compromised here today. Ask yourselves," Claire said, calm and level, "why a consulting fee to a company he secretly owns started showing up in our books a full year before my father died." The room went very still. She turned to Marcus, and he stood without being asked twice, walking to the front with the same unhurried economy he brought to any job site. He didn't talk about feelings, or fairness, or family loyalty. He talked numbers, return on renovated ceremony space, the premium couples paid for a working orchard over a generic banquet hall, industry data pulled from a decade-spent building for exactly this kind of venue up and down the East Coast. He dismantled Grant's maintenance argument the way he dismantled a joint that had been cut wrong from the start, methodically, without malice, until there was nothing left standing behind it for anyone to hide inside. "This is a family company," the older board member said quietly, the same one who'd questioned Claire 2 weeks earlier, addressing Grant directly for the first time all meeting. "Your uncle built half of what's sitting under this roof. I'd like to know how you sat across from him at this table and let him sign anything without telling him what you'd already agreed to behind his back." Grant didn't have an answer for that one. He tried anyway, something about protecting shareholder value, but the words came out thin, and nobody at the table was still listening closely enough to catch them. The vote came 8-1. Grant was suspended pending a formal review, escorted out by the same board member who'd questioned Claire's judgment 2 weeks before, the one who now wouldn't quite meet Grant's eyes on his way toward the door. Marcus found Claire alone in the emptied conference room afterward, still holding the folder Ruth had brought her, and for once neither of them reached for anything to say. She just exhaled, long and complete, like she'd been holding a single breath for an entire year. Marcus crossed the room and put a hand briefly on her shoulder. And that, for the moment, was enough for both of them. The days after the vote moved differently than the days before it, slower, less braced for the next blow. Marcus felt it in small ways. One morning at the hardware store on Front Street, the owner, a man he'd traded maybe 200 words with over 3 months of buying screws and sandpaper, waved him over to the counter and, without much ceremony, said he was glad Marcus was sticking around. Word had gotten out, the way it does in a town that size, that the contractor at the Bennett place had stood up in front of the board and helped save the orchard half the county got married at. The man didn't make a speech of it. He just said it, the way you tell someone their coffee's on the house, and went back to ringing up the next customer. It was a small thing. Marcus had spent 6 years in this town being the guy with the truck full of lumber. The one who kept to himself, the one nobody quite knew. Somewhere in the last few weeks that had changed without his noticing exactly when. He wasn't a stranger passing through anymore. He was a man this place had quietly decided to keep. The offer came the following week, through Vivian. A trade publication wanted to run a feature on him, the quiet return of the man behind the Marchetti stage. 6 years gone and, as far as anyone in New York knew, retired for good. Along with the article came something else, an email forwarded through Vivian from Alden and Rowe Events. They wanted him back. Freelance, high profile, no relocation required if he didn't want it. Just his name attached to their biggest jobs again, the way it had been before. Marcus read the email twice at his kitchen table that night, long after Elijah had gone to bed, and didn't answer it right away. He carried it with him for the better part of a week, turning it over the way he'd turn a piece of lumber before deciding what to make of it. On paper, it was everything his old career had been building toward before he walked away from it. Recognition, better money, work that would outlive him in photographs at other people's weddings for years. It was also, unmistakably, a door back to a version of his life that had ended the day his wife died, and he wasn't sure yet whether walking through it meant moving forward or just moving backward with better lighting on the whole thing. Claire heard about the offer from Vivian before Marcus told her himself. And when he finally did, sitting across from her on the same overturned crates where they'd first said the true things out loud, she didn't ask him to stay. "I won't pretend I don't want you here," she said. "But I'm not going to be the reason you turn down something you're proud of." "That's not why I'd take it," Marcus said. "And it's not why I wouldn't, either." Elijah settled it without meaning to, the way children sometimes settle the things adults spend weeks circling around. "Are you going to keep building stages here forever?" He asked over dinner one night, not looking up from his plate, the question landing with the weight only a 9-year-old can deliver without noticing it. Marcus didn't answer right away. He thought about New York, about the version of himself that had once flown out on a Thursday and come home on a Sunday and called that a life. He thought about the notebook of sketches still sitting in a box at the house, and the 6 years he'd spent building a smaller, steadier world for his son instead. 2 days later, he called Alden and Rowe back and turned down the standing offer, agreeing instead to a handful of freelance projects he could take on his own terms from his own shop without ever having to leave Traverse City for good. He didn't make an announcement about any of it. He simply kept showing up at the orchard every morning, the way he had for months, and let that be the whole answer. Harvest ended the way it always did. The last of the cherries stripped from the trees, the crew gathering for the small celebration Walter Bennett had started decades earlier, the one Claire had never once considered skipping, whatever else was happening in her life. Ruth was there, finally allowing herself to relax after weeks of feeling responsible for everything the vote had uncovered. Elijah ran between the tables with 2 other kids from the crew, sticky with cider, entirely unbothered by anything that had happened in a boardroom he'd never even seen the inside of. Off at the edge of the clearing, away from the tables and the string lights, Marcus had built something small. An arbor barely large enough for 2 people. Unconnected to any client's order. Unlisted on any invoice Ruth would ever see. Claire found it before anyone told her it was there, drawn by instinct more than direction. And she understood exactly what it was the moment she saw it standing alone in the dark. Marcus was waiting beside it, hands in his pockets, watching her cross the grass toward him. "You'd make a great bride someday," he said. The same words as before. Nothing about his voice the same as it had been that first afternoon. Claire stopped in front of him, close enough now that neither of them needed to raise their voice over the music drifting from the tables behind them. "Then I suppose," she said, "I found my groom." Somewhere behind them, Elijah was telling Ruth an elaborate story about a fish he claimed to have nearly caught that summer, and Ruth was laughing in a way she hadn't let herself in weeks. The string lights swayed over the folding tables. The trees stood the way they'd stood for 60 autumns, patient, unhurried, having watched this town grow up around them one season at a time. Marcus reached out and took Claire's hand, the first time either of them had let it be that simple. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. She hadn't been looking for a groom when this had started. She'd been looking for someone who wouldn't walk away the moment the orchard needed rebuilding. And under the arbor he'd built for no one but her, she finally stopped looking. That's where we'll leave them, under the lights, at the edge of an orchard that almost belonged to someone else. If this one stayed with you, even a little, do the small thing that keeps stories like it coming. Follow along, and I'll see you at the next one.